Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for OUP's annual Ask a VC webinar, where you can ask any and every question that you have about the inner workings of venture capital. I'm Kirsten Loita of Osage University Partners, and I head our university relations efforts here at OUP. We'll go to the next slide. I'm so happy to be joined today by two of my fellow colleagues, Matt and Manny. I'm going to have them each introduce themselves briefly. Matt, we'll start with you.
Great, thanks, Kirsten. So I'm Matt. I'm one of the managing partners here at OUP, and I co-manage all of our life science investing activities for the fund with my partner Bill. My background is PhD. Did that at Penn. Then spent a number of years at a strategy consulting firm called LEK in their New York office, primarily working with biopharma, medtech, and private equity clients. I then had the opportunity to join OUP in the early days of our first fund, a little over 12 years ago, and have not left.
Great. Thanks so much, Matt. Manny.
Yeah, thanks everyone. So I'm Manny Stockman. I'm a partner on our tech team. And as you all know, we kind of mirror tech transfer offices. There's a tech team and a life science team. My background's a PhD in applied physics and aerospace engineering. I then went to work at Lockheed Martin for a number of years, doing really early stage R&D, working a lot on DARPA programs, but also bringing together university researchers towards that mission. And ultimately in 2015, I joined OUP because it was such a unique model. And since I've been here, really focused broadly on tech. But some of my investments have been more focused on the hard tech spaces and computing and robotics and anything that's kind of software on top of hardware. So thanks, everyone.
Great. Thank you so much, Manny and Matt. And you guys are going to be hearing from them most of the time in this webinar. We are going to go through a few logistics first. We'll go to the next slide. We are going to have a recording of this webinar available afterwards. It will be sent out to everyone who registered for this webinar. You can also find it on our YouTube channel, as well as our partner portal. You can find links to both of those resources here. For our partner portal, you need to be at an academic institution in order to register for that and to receive all the benefits of the different types of things that we have in our partner portal. We have the other information about getting onto our YouTube channel here as well. And as I mentioned, we will send this out either later this week or early next week, the recording for this to everyone who registered for this. We do have a couple of upcoming webinars that may be of interest to you. On November 4th, we have our founder recruitment models for academic spinouts, where CU Boulder's Embark Deep Tech Startup Creator Program will be highlighted, as well as University of Michigan's Accelerate Blue Foundry will be highlighted. And then on December 3rd, we have our annual Your OUP Partnership webinar for all of our tech transfer partners to learn about your OUP partnership and how we work with you and provide these value-added benefits to you, such as this kind of webinar. We'll go to the next slide. A short intro on OUP for those of you who don't know us. We're a venture capital fund that partners with academic institutions to invest in their startups, typically by exercising the participation rights available through their licenses. For those who don't know about participation rights, they're the ability to invest in a future round of a company on the same terms and conditions as other investors. We do have recommended language for participation rights if your institution isn't currently including those in your licenses. As part of this partnership with academic institutions, they share in a portion of our profits based on the companies that we invest in out of those institutions, and then receive programmatic support on tech transfer and academic startups. We're now on our fourth fund here at OUP. We've made investments in over 150 companies in all areas of deep science, and many of those have had successful exits. We'll go to the next slide briefly just to show you a sampling of those companies that we've invested in. If you ever have any questions on our model, we can answer those right now. We can answer those on the Your OUP Partnership webinar, or just reach out to us. We're always happy to talk with you about our model. So with that, we are actually, I don't think there's another slide, right? Is that right, Katie? We're going to go and jump into the webinar today. We received a lot of questions ahead of time from the audience members, people who had registered for the webinar. And then we'd also encourage people throughout this webinar to ask questions. Please use the Q&A tool that is located on the toolbar. And put your questions in there, and then I will be kind of culling through those and asking them as they come up. So with that, we're going to start off on a very basic question for each of you, but obviously a really relevant one for anyone who I think who is watching this, and that is your thoughts on the current investment climate in each of the areas that you already talked about that you concentrate in. And Manny, I will start with you.
Yeah, sure. So it's a interesting and strange climate, and exciting and kind of scary, and all in both, in many ways. So, really what's been happening, I think everyone's been aware of the fundraising activity in certain sectors like AI, and that's really been dominating the investment category of tech. And startups that don't really have AI are kind of bringing it into their description and what they do. And so the numbers are a little bit shocking, right? I think it's like 75% of all deals this year have gone towards AI startups. I can imagine many of those startups being thin AI, but still, that's a dramatic increase. I think the previous, maybe 2022, it was like 20% of companies were AI, 20% of fundraising dollars were going into AI companies. Don't hold me to all these numbers, but we feel it. Like, what matters is, like, we sense this, we see it in the deal flow we're looking at. The deals that are getting done are the ones that are in that category. And I think it hits on two different themes generally. It's use cases of AI, vertical applications of AI, as well as anything touching the computing space. And so it really seems like a lot of the energy, a lot of the deal flow is focused on those two verticals. And it's been challenging for certain other markets. Like, without going to the weeds, like climate is now in a time where the companies in that space are having to figure out ways to get through this challenging fundraising environment. There's definitely still some of the fast, high flying climate startups that are able to continue to raise, but the challenging ones that are kind of working towards pilot and early scale are having difficulty. And so it's definitely, I think, of like one key theme of the current investment climate. It seems like a consolidation into specific categories, and then a long tail of other areas that are not very well funded. And then the other thing that we're still sorting through, I'd say, is there is a lot of very large investment rounds coming together, as everyone's seen, at like multi-$100 million rounds for companies that are less than 2 years old, driven by some of the mega funds that are out there and some of the excitement behind the opportunities they see. But also, some of the companies that are raising those rounds are seeing growth like investors have never seen before. And so revenue growth, not just technical progress. And so there's both reality to this, but also some concerns as to how these companies will deliver on exactly what they're saying. And so I think generally it's been both excitement and caution in the market, and consolidation around a few sectors. So I'll leave it at that and let Matt chime in as well.
Yeah, sure. So on the life science side, you can break that up into a few categories: therapeutics, devices, diagnostics, and research tools. No surprise, nothing's changed in terms of how those allocations sort of separate. Most still goes towards therapeutics, a little bit towards med tech, a little bit towards diagnostics, maybe less towards even tools. But within therapeutics, we've definitely seen a shift to more later stage investing, and by later stage I mean in terms of development of the medicines. A lot more interest in clinical stage assets, taking less risk, meaning me better, maybe assets licensed out of China. So not a ton of novel biology risk taking right now. And I think we've seen that, we feel it, as Manny said, but we also see it in the numbers that there are far fewer therapeutics new companies being formed, particularly around novel biology. And so there's definitely been that drop off of risk taking. And a lot of that has to do with sort of the paucity of late stage capital in the market right now. The generalist investors who are around in 2019, 2020, 2021, 2021 have largely walked away from this space. You can look at the public market, indexes for biotech companies. It's flat to down over the same time period, where you could argue, tech is up, 80% over the last 3-4 years on the public side. So, largely public markets have really struggled on the biotech side. A little bit of a winner for sure, no IPOs. And so it's really pushed the private investors to think about, okay, what can we invest in that, could be acquired, where we're not going to need to raise big crossover rounds. We're not going to need to go public. What's interesting. And then frankly, what is left that's interesting to the public market investors, which tends to be less risky kinds of things. So as an example, half-life extended antibodies, right? I saw some interesting data yesterday, though, was, well, what is pharma buying? What's the M&A look like? Turns out they're actually buying more novel stuff than one might expect. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between what investors are doing and what pharma has actually bought over the last, let's say, 12 months. But that early risk-taking capital just isn't there. We could argue that some of that's also macro. When interest rates are high, in general, people want to take less risk with their money. They'd rather, get their, guaranteed 6-7% interest. And so if we see interest rates continue to fall, as some predict into next year, there is a belief that that is good for biotech and will bring capital back. Med tech, still has largely been, from a VC perspective, relegated to very late clinical or commercial stage companies. There's a ton of interest in looking at commercial stage med tech right now, and things that could scale and do hundreds of millions over time, but get to 100 million in revenue, say in under 5 years. I think there's a ton of interest in that. A lot of those are recap kinds of investment rounds. They've taken a lot of money to get there, so have sort of ended up at high valuations. But investors, at least for those kinds of companies, are willing to come in, set a more appropriate and attractive valuation, and put together, what are some sizable commercialization rounds for those kinds of companies. Diagnostics continues to be difficult. A lot of that has to do with just huge capital requirements in these companies. Some glimmers of hope. I don't know if anyone saw $1 billion to 1 filed to go public. Explosive revenue growth in a very short period of time, from founding the company to doing hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue in the genetic prenatal genetic testing space. So more of that is great. But I think it'll take more wins and more ways to be more capital efficient, to have more success and more interest in diagnostics. And tools continues to be a very, just a tough business. Very few winners over time. And those winners tend to be paradigm changing kinds of things, not incremental differences. And so you can think of like Illumina, 10x Genomics, things that truly were leaders in totally new ways to measure science and data. Part I haven't talked about is AI companies, as Manny said. How does AI apply to life sciences and biology? And everything I think he says holds true. Tons of interest from the tech investor community in how one could apply AI to biotech and life sciences more broadly. And we see those companies certainly able to raise capital.
That's great. Thank you so much, Matt. You did have a couple of questions ahead of time about stage of development, when people are investing in life science opportunities in the different areas. So I really appreciate that elucidation of those particular areas. We did have some questions about platform technologies and advice for raising funds for platform technologies in this funding environment. Is there a certain value inflection to target at the seed stage? Is proof of mechanism enough, or do they need to have a patented asset to really raise in this environment for platforms?
Yeah, well, I'm going to speak for life science dedicated investors right now, and not for, let's say, like tech investors or tech bio investors, where they still have a lot of interest in platforms and sort of investing in those companies like they would invest in their tech companies. But for life science sort of focused investors, platforms for platform's sake have generally fallen out of favor. It's very, very much focused on, well, what are your programs coming off those platforms? What are you going to do with it? I think at seed, sometimes you can get away with not yet knowing if it's compelling enough, but very, very quickly at Series A, and especially by Series B, you got to know what you're going to do with it. What are those programs going to be? So I think it's definitely worth starting really, really, really early to say, okay, what are the targets we think are attractive? What are we going to do with this? What are we going to go after? What indications are we going to treat? Start building out target product profiles. It's especially important to realize that innovation for innovation's sake, or cool science for cool science sake, isn't good enough, right? It has to actually meet a patient unmet need. It has to change the way we treat patients. And more and more, it can't be small sort of changes, especially when you're really, really early at the platform stage. If you're a later stage company and you're doing half-life extended antibodies in the clinic, yeah, maybe you can get investor interest. But if you're an early platform company and you're claiming you're going to make some small tweaks, it may not be enough. So you got to really think very hard about what is you're going to do with that. An asset-focused investing, I think is still strong, particularly if you can elucidate a story around, why it's going to be not incremental, but truly paradigm changing for patients. So I don't know, did that answer the question, Kirsten?
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, yes,
Sure.
thank you, Matt. Manny, next question is to you. How can you find truly patient capital for the deep hard tech applications? This person has experienced that a lot of VCs say they do, but they really are still expecting an exit in 3 to 5 years. But this person in particular is looking for that early stage deep tech capital.
Yeah, I think there's, you know, for one, a little bit of a question I have in my mind as to what stage of investor you're thinking of, that you all may be thinking of when it's been challenging to find patient capital. Because I think really in the university space, in the spin-out space, there's kind of two groups of capital that often come to the table in our experience of the companies we've invested in. There's the really just, out of the gate, you know, university spin out with a few founders that do what most startups do. Look for angel investors and local investors to kind of stimulate and get the company out the door with maybe $1 million or a couple million. And then there's the rounds that we participate in alongside other institutional VCs, where we might invest 5, 6, 7 million in a seed round, or is it seed round, and then the company raises 20 or more in a Series A. In the rounds we see, and especially with the investors we commonly see in university spinouts, I haven't felt that same impatience, because we all know what we're getting into. Ultimately, I mean, I can't speak for the team in 2009 when OUP started, but the groups we work with now that have often been in university spinouts, they know what they're buying into, and they know it's going to take time. Now, I definitely have heard horror stories from founders who were working with small angel funds, local VCs that are just every so often dabbling in a university spinout, and they just think that there's a quick flip here, and there's no such thing in the deep tech space for certain. And so I think generally you want to really be looking at whether the investors your startups are talking to really have experience in the category, because it's not out of line for a founder to ask a potential investor, how do you think about the exit trajectory here? It's such a simple question, and it should just be discussed and discussed transparently. I think where impatience happens, and I feel this, and I do get impatient, is when our founders are too patient with progress and commercial progress, and they haven't been able to shed their technical roots of product development and getting to market and feeling that burn for customers. I see this often when researchers turn entrepreneurs get stuck in I can make this better, I can get this to 100%, and better is the enemy of good enough. You've got to get stuff into market, you've got to get prototypes out there, you got to get customers testing with things. And that's where patience can sometimes wear thin, when teams from university spinouts don't know how to flip into the commercial acceleration mode. And so those are how I think about it, both on the investor front, where I haven't seen it as much, but where I think the impatience happens less on exit, but more on company path, and whether they're really accelerating as much as they can, given the investor's experience seeing companies grow. So,
Great. Thanks.
I would say ditto for life science and biotech. Have seen folks dabble, especially in the 2020, 2022 timeframe, and get super impatient about the whole thing and now walk away. Biotech takes a long time, obviously. And in fact, also saw it from the LP side, right, where the limited partners who invest in venture capital funds, some of them would form a $50 million or $100 million fund to do biotech. they would hire somebody like I knew from a biotech VC fund to come and run it. And that was exciting for that person to get that opportunity. And within 2 years, pull all the money out and be like, this isn't for us. We're out.
Right.
So, seeing that trend.
And it was really interesting in the climate tech investment cycle, that super cycle that just happened and is going on now, is there was a bunch of early stage funds that came together and started doing climate tech. Some very expert level people and experienced funds came in and started to invest in the space, and we all saw the tremendous growth of that category. And then in response, there was a really interesting dynamic where very well-known growth funds created climate focus. Like, these are classic growth funds used to investing in revenue. And when I speak to some of my friends at those places, they're like, well, we didn't actually, like, we did, it turns out they're not ready for growth at all. And so what's been good about that space is there is capital waiting, but they're losing their patience waiting for these companies to be ready to grow. And so they're not really investing that much. They're really looking for companies that are in growth mode in that space. But there were a lot of funds created thinking that there'd be lots of opportunity to invest in growth stage climate, and there have not been.
We're going to move on to, we got 2 questions in right as Matt was talking earlier about medtech. And I think that people, there's always a lot of questions on the medtech side for academic institutions, because there's a lot of information that comes in, or a lot of opportunities that come in out of those. But just really quickly, Matt, I know you touched on medical devices before, but what is the market traction in general regarding medical devices, and how does the M&A outlook look for medtech?
Yeah, as I said before, it's really, the traction's really around late clinical to commercial stage med tech companies. M&A is more interesting to comment on. I didn't really speak to that earlier, which is there's actually been 3 med tech IPOs in the last few months. All of them were right around 30 million in revenue, which arguably is low for like a classical med tech IPO. And all 3 were able to get out. Not at absurd valuations, very reasonable valuations, but they got out, which is interesting. So that's one data point that, maybe there's an interest from public market investors in, investing in revenue generating medtech stories, and maybe funding them up through and growth and then ultimately profitability. The other interesting piece is, there's been many, many years, I'd say decades, of large medical device company contraction. They bought each other, which meant fewer acquirers. It was just announced that Deploy Synthis from J&J is spinning out of J&J. That's a kind of a reversal, right? So now, well, we're adding another potential acquirer. Now, does that mean J&J will no longer be an acquirer of medical device companies? Yeah, maybe. Deploy Synthis is very focused in a certain area of medical devices. But at least it creates a dedicated medical device company without competing interests that will likely be, acquisitive and want to acquire things that can grow, its revenue and EBITDA. So I think couple of trends that may be positive for the space, but I still say, these companies have to plan to get through FDA approval and scale revenue before, the most likely, M&A takeout occurs. Things always can happen earlier, but I think you got to plan for that to happen in that way.
Thanks so much, Matt. Manny, we have a question on AI, and it's hard to have any webinar conversation these days without talking about AI, and you already did discuss AI some. But this has been quite a lot of investment in VC dollars going into AI this year, et cetera. What is the forecast on that? What is it looking like? And what does OUP look at when it's looking at AI opportunities, and kind of where it's headed on that?
Yeah. So I'll add in one of the other parts of the written comment is when will the bubble burst, or how will it burst, or how bad will it be? And what I think is really interesting, if you look back, like, I wasn't an investor during the dot-com bubble, but I know some of the companies that came out of it, and I'm glad that dot-com bubble happened because of what was created at that point. And I'm pretty certain there's going to be a Fortune 50 company created out of what's happening right now. Whether it's going to be the next Facebook or Google, I don't know, but it really, really seems like the AI boom that's happening right now is a certainly a new way to retrieve knowledge, just like the internet was. And, if it takes $100 billion to figure that out to create the next $4 or $5 trillion company, I mean, I think that's really exciting. And so the really common thinking amongst the market is like there is going to be something out of this that is going to be enduring and valuable. It's going to be some AI level platform company that exists. It's also going to be the infrastructure that supplies it that will create new opportunities for plenty of new technologies and physical hardware. Um, but there's going to be a lot of venture money lost in this time period because there can't be many winners, but also some of these valuations just don't quite make sense to a lot of us, except for in a few of the big winners. And so that's where it seems like there's been an over exuberance that's going to come to a head. And where I'm starting to think through like when it comes to a head and how it's, I'm not an expert in this space. I've been talking to people at some of the data center in the data center world and trying to who are involved in that. And people think a lot about when the all the plans for build out of capacity are going to hit a bottleneck, and why. Because as soon as you have this merging of over preparation of hardware for supposed demand and it doesn't get delivered on, there's going to be concerns. And so people talk about whether we're going to hit some foundry challenges, whether we're going to hit real estate challenges, power challenges. That might be the culminating event that's really interesting to think about, but that's not going to happen for several years. It's not a this year thing. It's definitely a couple years. And in the meantime, we're all still looking to find the companies that will feed the beast of the data center compute world, right? So that's both from the hardware level. We're looking at a lot of AI infrastructure investments in hardware, and then also not necessarily, especially out of universities, we don't necessarily see the next OpenAI or Perplexity coming out of a university effort just because those others are so far ahead and it takes a lot of capital to do it. But we do see a lot of interesting researchers taking their skills in AI, being a little bit efficient and scrappy in how they do that, and apply it to very vertical applications. And so we've seen really accelerated growth in some startups that have been able to take their knowledge of AI and apply it to things like um, SAP or infrastructure monitoring, things that required external knowledge. And that's the key for your researchers in the AI world, is to see how they can go find industry experts that will leverage their skills to help build a product that solves a really big pain point that was typically services heavy previously. And so we're looking at those vertical applications as well as anything in the kind of hardware and compute space.
Great. Thanks, Manny. A question that came in from the audience from the registrants themselves. Are there any market size limit VCs won't invest in? Matt, do you want to take that one first? Anything in the life sciences area you want to mention?
Yeah. I mean, ultra rare, ultra orphan diseases has gotten really challenging. Even rare disease in general. A lot of that has to do with just what the acquirers want. Most of the big pharma companies aren't interested unless you're talking, at least $1 billion revenue opportunity, but most are saying now $2 billion revenue opportunities. So, that makes it really tough to say, okay, we can do ultra orphan, could be a $300 million a year drug, and like think that someone's going to buy that. I mean, that's really tough. I mean, even subset, and I'm not just talking about like genetic disease, I'm talking about like oncology. Like there's subsets of targeted, oncology where you have a target and it makes up, let's say, I don't know, 15% of the ovarian cancer population. Even if it works really well, it's a $350 million peak sales opportunity. It's like just really hard to think about who's going to want that and when, and how much does it cost to get you there for what reward. I mean, pharma companies will do NPV calculations and say, hey, this is an NPV negative project. So I think that's tough. So that's one. In med tech, if you don't have clinical data, on actual human beings, it's really hard to get that funded. I mean, you're looking at grants, usually angels, typically surgeons, doctors, wanting to fund stuff like that. They tend to lose their shirts though, because by the time you get enough data to have VCs interested, you've spent too much, and then the VCs come in and recap with a down round, and so I don't know how long that carousel will last.
Manny,
On the tech side, we generally think we don't have a hard number, like just to like inside baseball. It's not like we say, oh, this is a $2.5 billion TAM. Let's not do it. And even when we try and talk about it, we're not very sophisticated in saying this is a large enough TAM. But when we start to see a company that's going after like a $1-2 billion market, we get it. We just like, is this big enough? And sometimes it's not just about how big the market is, it's how fragmented it is, how consolidated your customer base is. Are you going to be selling products that are $10,000 a customer or $200,000 a customer? So there's no set guideline that we think about in terms of total TAM. And generally, like what we start to have no questions about is when it's north of $10 billion to $20 billion. And there's actually, not that many markets that clearly fit that. I will say we still invest in companies that have no market. Like, one of our best performing companies, one of our best returners is IonQ, a quantum computing company. And, when we invested, there was no market for quantum computing that you could define. You could imagine what it could be, and it's still not that today. You'd still look at what's going on and say, hey, this market's not very big. But we believed at a point that it would grow and it could become something. And so when your startups are evaluating TAM, don't just dismiss it just because there's no market today. If they're the first entrants, first in class, that's really what matters. And as long as it's a generally $1 billion to $2 billion opportunity in that case, that's okay. If it's going to be competing against multiple players, it's got to be a much bigger market.
Manny, we have a question specifically about drones and UAS. What are VCs looking for in companies that are involved in making drones, and how can a startup company in there get attention and stand out to those VCs?
Yeah, it's a question I'll try and give a simple answer to, because there's a lot of drone companies, a lot of startups out of universities have drone technology. And I think there's a couple things that are non-technical about what a good solution is what a good drone startup could look like. We're not experts. We haven't invested in any. I've spoken to some. I come from the defense world. I think most of the drone work today is going towards DoD, which is exciting and interesting. And so I think it has to be focused on like, not whether your drone can fly itself, whether it can go search out opportunistic targets on its own. It's not the technical capability, it's the actual solution has to be really applied to a specific large opportunity with the DoD. So you have deep knowledge of a problem that they have in a specific scenario, and you go win in that category because you can demonstrate it. A lot of the drone companies we see will say, hey, we've got really good onboard AI compute, or look, we've got because our ultrasonic sensor helps us do things, we're a much cheaper drone. I think those stories are not really resonating on the market, and it's really about the full solution. The other is go find someone that has been a part of the DoD space in some way. There's a lot of talent coming out of the successful DoD startup companies like Anduril and Saronic. Like, go try and network into people from that category to see who you can bring on your team. And if not that, maybe you bring in someone from the DoD world. But it's not a space I have seen companies fully succeed in yet, because there's a lot of noise. And the last thing I'll add is, like, you might have some opportunities to talk about manufacturing and scalability and made in the USA. Those are some things I think that will start to matter. I don't know if anyone saw the $1 trillion announcement that JP Morgan made yesterday about investments they want to make in certain categories, and DoD and Made in America were a big part of that.
Yeah, if anyone would like a link to that, or otherwise you can Google it, we're happy to provide that as well. I'm going to go into some kind of general advice about talking with VCs, approaching VCs, getting information back from VCs, and pitching. So Matt, I'll start with you on this one. How do you effectively get not just intros, but also responses from investors, considering the very high volume that you guys get all the time about opportunities that are possible investments for you? How does someone stand out to you as an investor?
Yeah, I mean, it's like stuff we would always say, or you probably have heard before, which is, get an intro from someone they know, someone they might trust. That always helps. I know it's not always possible. And not every VC is going to respond the same way, right? I will reply to LinkedIn messages if it makes sense for me to. And when I say that is like if someone sends me something that should have been sent to Manny, like an AI company in some tech space, I
Like
usually
2 days
won't.
ago.
Like 2 days ago. Well, that was at least for pharma. So, it's okay, send it to me. But, if it's not in my space, I may not respond because, just you do get a lot. But if it's in my space, I usually respond and say, hey, send me a deck. So that's my next point. If you're going to email me, please send a deck. Like, please send a non-confidential deck or something to react to. If it's just a blurb, it's hard to know. Am I wasting your time or are we wasting time? Like it's just impossible to know. So send a deck, can flip it quickly. 10 to 15 slides is awesome. 60 is too many. And can quickly figure out, yeah, this is interesting or it's not, and here's why. And we try to give feedback if we can. But the old adage, like, look, you try to get introductions or connections via people they might know or people they might trust is always the best route. Cold can work. It's not crazy. Cold reach outs. But know who you're reaching out to. More and more we see blasts where someone is clearly blasting hundreds and hundreds of VCs using some AI automation tool off some list they downloaded from the internet, and it's incredibly obvious, and those go right to the trash bin. So personalize, make it clear that you've actually understand that this person does invest in this space. Don't, send me a hardware deal, you're not going to get a response. So I think all those are probably the key things to give advice around. But I think I guess the one last piece I would say is, if you reach out, I think the best thing to typically do is say, if this is of interest, happy to set up a call. But when you reach out, like with the only request being, let me set up a call so I can pitch you without any real information on what you're doing or a deck, I think it's just more likely to lead to kind of wasting everyone's time, the entrepreneurs and yours. So usually best to kind of reach out, tell them what you're doing, recognize that they may or may not be interested, and then offer a call, if there's interest. But, if not, would appreciate any feedback you could provide. And often the better entrepreneurs ask, and if you know anyone who might be interested in the future, you come across anyone, would appreciate an intro. And I think that's a good way to handle it.
Anything you'd add, Manny?
Only one thing, because I completely agree with everything Matt said. We're getting blasted by AI tools now often. And I wouldn't say we leverage tools like that ourselves. So we're just really careful in how we do it, as should an entrepreneur. The one thing I'll add is, like, one thing I get really disappointed on from startups is they don't realize the power of their network. So it's, when they go to conferences, they talk to just the academics instead of seeking out the industry people that are there. Or at a lot of technical conferences now, there are venture investors. So start to leverage that network really well, and leverage the ask. Do you know anyone else that'll be interested in what I'm doing? Or better yet, you've already done your homework and you said, hey, I'm trying to get an introduction to someone at OUP or Matrix because they just did, deals that are kind of similar. Would you be able to introduce me to someone at those firms? Like, you can always do your homework and have a couple firms that you are looking to ask other people to get connected to. What I don't like is when I ask an entrepreneur anything we can do to be helpful at the end of a conversation. Maybe I've passed or maybe I've wanted to do more work, and they say, hey, can you introduce me to other firms? I'm like, well, which ones? There's hundreds. And they haven't really figured out and done the work to know who they want to get connected to make the key 4 or 5 firms that they want to ask about. And I would, if I can, and the person's great, I would love to just try. I just want to make sure they've done their homework and they're not putting it on us. So.
Thanks. We have a follow-up question to this about what advice would you give university researcher turned entrepreneur in preparing for conversations with or pitching to investors? So if they're doing this for the first time, what's the best advice that you can give this university researcher? Manny, I'll start with you.
One thing I've always found is I love researcher entrepreneurs who have gotten their PhD, taken the time to get their PhD in the commercial category they're going after. Like they've studied for their qualifier exam in, I don't know, synthetic chemicals, history of synthetic chemicals getting to market. And they've really taken the time to understand what's gone on in that space, um, startups that have existed, the supply chains that exist, the path to market. No, you're not going to become a fab, and you might actually be two or three tiers down from a fab, given what someone's doing. And so they really take time to map both how their eventual technology is going to turn into a product and get to market and who they have to sell to, but also the history of companies that have done it before and who's failed along the way. Because naturally, a lot of the groups we work with, a lot of the groups you all work with at universities have incredible inventions. No shortage of researchers coming to us with groundbreaking technology. And the majority of them think that it's just their competitors or someone, some previous effort just didn't hit a technical spec, and that's why the company failed. And I'd say like that's rarely what I see. I most often see companies failing because the market they went after is too hard to access, or they weren't ready to pivot when they saw something that was in their way. And so all of these things are really interesting history for you as an entrepreneur to go study before you go pitch to VCs, because in general you're speaking to generalists. No one VC is an expert in every category, but we've seen a lot. We're doing pattern matching, but man, I love it when I have someone that knows more than me in that side of things, because we don't know enough. So that's what I would love for more researchers to bring to the table when their first pitches.
Matt, anything you'd add to that?
I agree with that last point. I hope to learn something every time I go in, and not just science, ideally. I hope to learn more. So that said, it's a little different tech life science. In tech, and I don't know if this question implied this, but university researcher turned entrepreneur. Does that university researcher plan to lead the company? More common in tech, especially software, AI. You see it a lot now. And yeah, that's in life science, super different. Like, the advice is hopefully they are not coming to me telling me they want to lead the company and be the CEO and have their day job and this, or even hopefully they're not even telling me they want to leave the university and be the CEO. That's usually not good for therapy, especially for therapeutics companies. So, the advice is, be humble, know what you don't know, talk about, you need help, right? You're looking for feedback. What kind of other kinds of data do I need to generate? Any thoughts on how I can attract industry veterans or people who know how to do drug discovery to help me with this? Where can I go? Who can I work with to advance this to the point where investors would be interested? But a little different than what Manny said is like, I won't hold it against somebody if they don't know, let's say, all the competitors and the history and all that. I understand it's not their space. If you want to go be the CEO of a company, you better know all that stuff, right? It's huge red flag if you don't. But if you're just the science person and you're staying at the university, you'll be an advisor on the science. It's okay. I think we understand, like, you may not know all those nuances, and we're happy to share those things and say, hey, go look at this data or this company and what they've generated, some clinical data. How are you going to demonstrate that you have the potential to be better than this? And they go back and think about that, and I think that's a good interaction.
So we just got a question in that's reminiscent of a question that was also sent in beforehand. So I really like to get to this one because obviously it's pressing to people. And obviously our audience is very focused on university startups. And the question is, what sorts of training do you wish the university startups and their founders had that maybe you don't see as often, or that could perhaps be addressed more by the universities to help prepare those startups for going out and raising capital? Matt, can I start with you on that one?
Yeah, and I'll use therapeutics as an example. Whether this is training them or giving them support with resources or connecting them to somebody at the business school, it really is what we are just talking about. It's how do they put their discovery in the context of what's happened before, and not just products that are on the market, but products that are in clinical development, preclinical development, other targets. How do they fit in? How do they relate? It's a bunch of work, right? And so sometimes it's just like literally just throwing time against it, Googling, trying to find resources, figuring out what you can, reading news articles, going to websites, looking back at their news articles and their press releases and trying to piece it together. That's time consuming and it's hard. So that's why I say, is it training them for them to do it? Are they going to be like, throw up their hands? I don't have time for this. So can you connect them with somebody who can help them with it, that's interested in getting that kind of experience or training, like a business school student or a PhD student, postdoc, or a club? To me, that's like the number one thing, is just knowing how you might fit into the broader history and what's happening now. And just having a better sense of that really, 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 really helps. It really, I think it shines a light for faculty on, one, how good the data needs to be for anyone to care. And two, sometimes for platforms, are they just barking up the wrong tree on an indication? I actually had a tech transfer person reach out recently and said, "Hey, we have a company at, I don't know, a discovery, we have a target, and the researcher's thinking about 3 different potential indications," and wanted some feedback on them. And I said, "Look, I don't know anything. You didn't tell me the target, and I don't know if there's like the biology matches all 3 of these. I'm just going to take your word for it that it might, or that there's human genetics or some sort of target validation here. But of these 3, one is clearly more interesting from a commercial perspective than the other 2." And so, that we're able to give them that feedback. But if that's the stuff you can kind of do in house and quickly figure out that, like, hey, just because something's easy doesn't mean it's or you perceive it as being easier, doesn't necessarily mean it's the right first thing to do.
Manny, any thoughts on that question?
No, I think I generally agree with Matt, as it would apply to tech. So let's leave it there and see what kind of questions we can go through in the time we have left.
Great. This is actually a bit of a follow-on question to that. What are the details in a pitch deck that have the greatest impact to a VC that many startups maybe fall short on providing? What do you typically see in those areas? Is there anything in particular that you're like, oh, I wish more startups would provide more information on this? Manny, do you have anything to add there?
Probably 2 top of mind. I mean, I think I always get a little bit surprised when startups treat their own set of early customer engagements as very stealthy and confidential, and ultimately, there's not much that we worry about on the tech side in confidentiality, or that we worry about we sign NDAs. But things like customer discovery, like, it's always really, you should just be overly sharing your traction in some ways. Like, those things matter, and it's really important to do that in a crystal clear way. The other thing I was thinking about was, I always think the team slides gets like the least discussion of any meeting. And it's not like, hey, I'm professor here and I've been involved in XYZ startup before. It's not just like going through the resumes verbally, because that often doesn't happen either, but it's not what I want to hear. It'd be real. I've been starting to recently like try and focus in on, like, how did you decide your role? Like, you're forming together. How did you all decide who's the CEO, who's the CTO? Who have you gone to speak to? If this is your first time as a CEO, who have you been learning from? Like, what's made you think you're the right person for this role? And ultimately, it's in some ways, as a researcher switching into a startup, you're applying for a new job. Just because you're the founder doesn't mean you deserve to, let's say, be at the company. We're going to hire you. We're going to help pay you to do the job you want to do. So let's talk about it and how you came about that process, and treat it like a mutual interview. And so I always think the team slides could have a more natural discussion than they often do. And it's our fault just as much as it is the startup's fault. But creating a better discussion of team is something I think is often left out of pitch decks.
Thanks, Manny. Matt, anything you'd add to that?
Just data.
Okay.
A deck without data. A deck without data doesn't go anywhere.
Right. It's like if it just in our mind, like, what's the data you have that your customers care about your product for life science? It's like, why is this?
So yeah, it's not just the research data. It is customer discovery data that this is actually has traction.
Yeah, on the tech side, I'm talking
on the tech side, right? The life science
side, it's like actual, scientific data.
Right.
I see too many decks with none.
Right.
Any advice for determining which investors have the appetite or pockets to lead an investment round? Obviously, getting your lead investor is like a huge hurdle for each company to get over. So, getting that lead investor, any advice for finding those people who want to lead? Manny, I'll start with you.
I think it's, do your research. PitchBook, I believe, has a tool that tells, a part of their tool is like they tell you who led the round, to the extent it's not always published well there, but you can start to get a sense of looking at whether the companies in your space have, who's led them, who's led their rounds. And so you can start to get a sense of the leads in that space. But I'd also say, look at the fund size, divide by the typical number of portfolio companies, and then maybe divide by, so then you get like an average check size for in a company, and then divide by 2. And does that check size fit into the slot of, let's say, 70% of your round, right? So if a $50 million fund has made, generally 20 investments, like they're not putting that much into each company. And so they're not going to be a lead for a 10 or $15 million Series A. So just do the quick math, but also just ask them. A lot of startups try and say like, hey, there's no quicker way to turn me off, I guess, as an investor when someone says, oh, hey, we don't want to talk to you right now. We're looking for a lead. And any investor can make it, depending on their check size, can make a dent in your round, and we'll be able to help you find that lead. And so something to think about is just have an open mind and keep all your discussions going. It's not as hard to find out who leads and who doesn't. And if you're confused, just ask them in an appropriate way. How do you think about leading versus following? Not do you lead? Is that, the more kind of appropriate way to ask the question.
Great answer. Matt, anything to add?
It's never been harder to find a lead investor for a biotech company than it is probably right now. Maybe the last time the market collapsed in like 01. But it's really, really hard. We're seeing a lot of inside-led rounds with existing investors leading. Companies will say, I got a bunch of interested parties. I just need a lead. It's just really, really hard. I don't have a ton of advice on it, to be honest. You just got to convince somebody to get over that hurdle. And it's such a tough market that I think more and more maybe one piece of advice, more and more of these companies may need to like connect parties together who are interested, like, and say, oh, like, can I connect you to so and so? They've also expressed interest. If you're overselling their interest, not good. But if they have genuine interest and you can connect people, that might help just with trying to catalyze something more. In the past, people have been all super hesitant to do that because they think everyone's going to lead and they're going to get multiple term sheets. And if they connect them, then there's only one term. This is a tough market for biotech, so I think you got to be a little scrappier.
We've got a lot of questions left and a short time to get them in. We'll get in the ones that we can. And for those of you who are writing in right now, we'll try to do some follow-up with you afterwards as well. This question asks that they found many VCs that don't want to look at detailed tables and testing methods in a pitch deck. How do you thread the needle with what information you actually should put in the pitch deck versus, and this is a person especially asking about medtech, versus what should go in the data room? And Matt, I'm going to put this to you first because they asked about med tech in particular. But yeah, what should go in the deck versus the data room?
Yeah, I mean, like, look, no eye charts. Like, obviously, a dense data table, is hard. The biggest problem with data tables and methods and stuff is what researchers tend to do is they take some paper or some grant and they copy paste out of that and put it into the deck with zero context. Like, because it's easy for them and it's fast. And in fact, I know that's what they do when they give you guys disclosures. They take some grant and some aim and they copy paste it and they just send it to you. And that's not really ideal, maybe what you even need as, when you get a disclosure. So to me, that is the biggest problem is they don't think about like, okay, let me actually distill the data here. What's actually most critical to know? But I do think you need to put on enough on the slide where you don't need a voiceover. Like someone can read it and understand, how did they do the experiment? What were the doses? What was the duration of dosing? How frequently did they dose? And there are lots of great ways to put that in, into a graph or graphically, kind of put that on there, little things. And so one piece of advice is like, how many good decks do you have access to? Where, folks have said, this is a really good pitch deck. That's a really good pitch deck for therapeutics. That was a really good pitch deck for med tech. I think OEP has some resources around this, right, Kirsten, on like what does a good deck look like? What does a good pitch deck look like? What does a good slide on this topic look like or that topic look like? if you have some from your ecosystem and you can learn from them, I think that's another great way to go about this. But you need data. I'm not saying you need to reveal the target or any confidential IP in a non-confidential call. You can call it target X if you want, but you got to show what target X can do in a given model on a cell. Um, for med tech, what kind of prototype data do you have? You put it into an animal, what did it do? Was it a large animal, small animal, or human clinical data? We did an investigator-initiated trial, we did 10 patients. Here's what we saw happen. So I think all those things are important. Yeah.
Right. Thanks, Matt. Manny, when founders are pitching to investors, what do they need to understanding regarding the returns models of those investors and how that affects the life cycle of the startup and because of what the investors are expecting? And this is a pretty broad question. And I will note to people, we actually have full webinars on this, but it is important for when someone is going in and pitching and understanding how venture capital returns work and what it is that they then have expectations regarding that life cycle of the startup or exit
Yeah,
cycle, I should say.
I think the common problem is they often just leave returns out of their own mental math. As soon as they take on investor money, as their duty as a leader of the company is to make they have a fiduciary duty to make their investors money, and it's not that to really understand their interest and what they need. And so oftentimes I don't find that entrepreneurs are doing the math on what their VCs need to do in their company in that startup to make the returns that will help them raise fund after fund after fund. And generally that means it's not, hey, get 2 or 3x your money back. It's we need to get 10 to 15 10x our money back is what you'd call a real big win on the life of investing in a company to make up for the losses that we will eventually take in some of the other risky investments we've made. And so doing that math is something I think they often don't understand. And then for the ones that do, it's still a little bit more nuanced in how they see how their math, our math could affect their math, and vice versa, because there's no shortage of capital out there today. For certain startups, I should say. Sorry, we talked a lot about how hard it is to raise, but startups can raise $100 million today in a shocking amount of time if they're in the right category, and they'll do it at pretty good valuations, $400 million valuations. But for, let's say, a fund like ours, that's not as interesting as, all right, hey, maybe we do a $10 million raise at a 20 or 30 pre, and then that helps you get to their next value inflection that you'll raise $70 million at 100 pre. And then the math of deciding how that future dilution path is different than the $100 million raise all at once at a $400 million pre, for both the entrepreneur and for the VC that wants to invest early and take the risk, is often left out of the discussion. And so it's really interesting for entrepreneurs to really think through that. And it's a hard decision because, sure, if you can raise 100, it feels really good. But don't forget about how that might affect the investors that you want to bring into the mix.
We only have a couple of minutes left for our regularly scheduled slot for this. We will go an extra 15 minutes just because we have so many questions. We understand people are going to have to drop off. Katie put a link in the chat to a survey for us. We'd really appreciate if you would fill that out for us. Just to tell us, what you thought of this webinar, ideas for future webinars. But we're going to answer a few more questions before we get to our ending. So we will record this. So if your question wasn't answered, we'll try to get to the rest of these at least quickly. Before the end of the 15 minutes after the hour. We're going to follow up, since you were talking about limited partners, but there are a couple of questions that we have about limited partners, Manny. But Matt, I'm going to go to you for this question first. When the limited partners, and a reminder, those are the investors in the venture capital fund. When they make their commitments to the venture capital funds, what are those limited partners looking for when evaluating the venture capital groups that they invest in? And Matt, I'm going to go to you for this first because that can be often different depending on the industry area and honestly the limited partners and what it is that they're interested in investing in.
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna create 2 categories of limited partners just to make it simple. The ones that care about making money and the ones that are strategic and care about seeing things within your portfolio or more broadly that add value to their broader business. So like corporates. All right, let's talk about the folks who want to make money, right? That is their number one goal. So for an entrepreneur, once they understand that their investors that sit on their board are guided by one thing, at least primarily, which is to make their investors money. We all want to do well by doing good. Like in biotech, that is an important mantra. And you want to do what's right by patients. But frankly, like we answer to somebody, and everyone has a boss, and our bosses are our investors, and they want to make money. And so, you know, really those investors that want to make money are looking for our performance. What are our performance metrics? So how much money did we make and how fast did we make it? And what are they benchmarking against? Putting their money in the S&P 500, right? Safer other kinds of investments. And they're benchmarking us against that, public market equivalents, but also other VC funds. And their portfolio isn't made up of just VC funds. It's much, much, much broader. These are foundations. These are large asset managers. So they have public market investing strategy. They have private market investing strategy, which also includes real estate. It includes private equity funds, hedge funds. It's just a really broad. And venture capital is a really tiny sliver of what they're allocating capital to. And then within that sliver, they're evaluating the different managers in their portfolio. Some just do life science. Some just do tech. Some funds do both, and they're just trying to build a portfolio. And then every year that, every cycle they're reevaluating. Is this in the bottom quartile? Do I need to cut these managers? Am I going to renew? Am I going to participate in the next fund or not? And so we're being judged on, frankly, financial performance. And that's the main thing. The strategics or the corporates, as I'm referring to, they're really interested in, well, what value did I get out of the relationship over the last 5 years before they decide if they're going to renew? Did they introduce me to their portfolio companies that I did a deal with, that I partnered with, that I acquired? Did they connect me to some startup they were looking at, and we were able to make a co-investment with them, and we wanted to put in some money? They're looking for what strategic value did the relationship bring them before they decide if they're going to renew and invest in the next fund that the VC fund is raising. So it's not super complicated. It's really just that's really what it is. And yeah, so they each have their own strategies and their own allocations. And, we touch thousands of frogs to be able to raise capital, just like an entrepreneur might.
Manny, anything you have from the tech side?
I think the only thing I've learned over time here is quickly when I first started was LPs are doing the same thing we are in some ways. Like they are looking for, like there is a selection bias. Everyone knows the top tier funds. But not every LP can invest in the best funds, at least historically the best funds, because it's hard to access those funds, just like it's hard for venture investors to access Elon Musk's next startup. Like you can't just do that. And so they're looking to bet on talent and model and really interesting ideas to build a fund on, because they want to be a part of the next, generational VC fund. And so they're really trying to evaluate those opportunities as well.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions on here about accelerators and startups getting experience with accelerators. I don't think we work a ton with accelerators. Obviously, we know a lot of accelerators, academic institutions that work with academic institutions that some of these startups work with. We run some, accelerator-like programs with our involvement with Equalize and Science to Startup. But any thoughts about accelerators when startups are considering accelerators that they should be thinking about? Like, is this the right accelerator match for me? Is that something that you have much experience with that you'd be willing to share, Manny?
Yeah, I think there's two buckets of accelerators, incubators. There's the ones that you go to if you can get accepted, that have the kind of classic Bay Area street cachet attached to them, right? So these are like the YCs of the world that get you the exposure to the fundraising base you need to raise your first round. There's starting to be a little bit too much noise out of YC in general. I've heard, we've never really hunted there because it's not super active in the university space, but a lot of the institutional VCs have not found it as interesting as it used to be, even though great companies have and will continue to come out of there. But then there's like this new crop of accelerators, incubators that are popping up with real industry expertise in them. And I'm excited to see what comes out of them. There's semiconductor ones, there's quantum focused incubators. There's groups like Tandem Launch that are focused on creating companies and incubating IP there that I really like what they do. I'd say in general, like I kind of just let that all, I'm like, I just try and be downstream of that. It's hard to be everywhere at all these incubators and accelerators. And we just don't have time as VCs to kind of pick our favorites. We just have to see the deals as they come to us, and try and, be involved in what they do by having good relationships every so often with where they are. But I think the vertical focused accelerators, to the extent you can get them, are more interesting to us than, hey, we went to YC, now we're fantastic.
Great, thanks. Matt, I'm going to ask you a question about neuro and CNS and biopharma. This attendee had been seeing a lot of acquire interest in the area, but was wondering about investment activity in the area.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting to hear that you're seeing a lot of acquirer interest. I don't know if I'm seeing that. Curious to hear more about that. If you're kind of big pharma coming to you, want to do direct licensing deals on targets, very interesting. Love to talk about that. Um, Within CNS, it's a lot of focus from investor community is on delivery. There are targets, right, that we've known about for a while. Um, tau and some other things where like they're just hard targets, and getting delivered to the brain is really hard. If we could degrade tau, that'd be great, but getting a protac in the brain, super hard. So, I think that we have some targets that I think are smart. I think human genetics, targets with human genetic validation are incredibly important within neuroscience. Um, but delivery remains, a critical challenge. And so there's been a ton of investment in delivery, different delivery approaches, brain shuttles and things like that. AbbVie acquired a company, Aliada, for brain shuttle technology. So, I think that's probably been one of the bigger focuses within neuro more recently. Um, so, I mean, but there's a ton of unmet need. Quite frankly, there's just a huge amount of unmet need. So if you have a novel target, I think the key thing to do is try to make a list of like, well, what could possibly validate this target without me having to put a drug into humans? And so things like human genetics can be really, really critical in, convincing somebody that, the target has, real potential.
Thanks, Matt. We have a few questions about tech transfer and VC interactions. Manny, are there any general or specific terms and license agreements that either help or hinder investment due diligence, in particular in these startup opportunities?
This is a tricky one. So in general, no, I have not found a license has got in the way of my investor due diligence process. So as long as a person's not referring to tech transfers due diligence, which is, I think, a set of terms and licenses, that's asking their startups to let them do diligence on milestones and things. In general, I haven't found that to be a challenge for us. So I think I'll just leave it there. Like,
Okay.
it doesn't get in the way of us doing our work in due diligence.
That's
Yeah.
fine. All right. Next question is on messy cap tables. Always everyone's favorite subject. Those messy cap tables that investors look at and maybe hold their heads a bit about. So when people talk about messy cap tables in general, first of all, what is meant by a messy cap table, and why are messy cap tables potentially an issue for the startups themselves and for their potential VC investors? Manny, I'm going to direct that one to you.
Yeah, I think it's the simple way to think is we just can't, after the first dollar has gone in, which generally, we are not the first dollar, usually it might be an angel, family and friends around. After the first money has gone in, it's almost impossible to fix a cap table. No one wants to do it. It's really difficult because you can't increment, you can give options to, let's say, founders who are under allocated, but you can't give just options or shares to a preferred investor. And so in general, it's just too difficult to fix later. And I define a messy cap table in general as two modes. One is unfair distribution of equity amongst the people that are really doing the work at the company. And the other is, uh, investors or, yeah, let's talk about the investors on the cap table who have somehow kind of bought into the company at a price that's not really market, and now they have too much control over the company's future. And so usually it's not, I don't often see the investor problem as much as I see the uh, disincentivized founders because one of their peers who's either no longer working for the company or never went to really work for the company has a large slug of the opportunity. And so I always say like the best way to discuss this process, this is the most common talk we've given at OUP, is to try and do it on data, assume it shouldn't be equal. Don't start from a place of equality, start from a discussion of what you're going to do in your role at the company and assume it will not be equal because not everyone's going to be able to commit the same amount to what the startup's future is and be willing to have hard conversations because if you can't have them on day zero of the company, it's not going to get any, you're not going to want to start a company with these people because you're going to have lots of other hard conversations along the way.
Thanks, Manny. All right, we have just a few minutes left. Matt, have you seen any impact in the VC community so far regarding their actual investment activity in university IPSOs seeded startups? Has there been any impact from the recent letters that the federal government has been sending to academic institutions regarding the Bayh-Dole Act and research funding? Have you guys has there been any conversation or impact within the VC community?
So just so everyone knows, I think this related to like exercising margin rights, blah, blah, blah. I mean, the short answer is no. Have not seen any impact yet.
Thanks. All right, Manny, next question is about bringing on CEO. Everyone's favorite subject also is about talent. We actually had very few questions in general about talent this time, which is usually one that is a large one for us. Any advice on how to approach bringing on a CEO when you're a pre-revenue company in the tech space?
Yeah, I think the pre-revenue, there's a wide range of startups from zero to pre-revenue. So, but in general, I think, the best way to approach bringing on a new CEO is to really run a process, right? Where that can be two means. One is you leverage your entire network, the people that are on your board, the investors you've brought onto your cap table, investors you've spoken with but didn't invest in your company, to see if there are people in that large network which could be, really exceptional and talented CEOs. And it's mostly, be committed to it and realize as the founder of the company, or if you are the current CEO, that like the very, best thing you can do as a CEO is hire incredible talent into your company. And I've told this to a few of ours, like I can't look, I always look forward to the day where you bring so much talent to me as a decision, to make a decision as to whether to hire or not, that I'd say like we can't afford this because of budget constraints. Like I would love to be posed with the challenge of like, man, should we stress our budget to hire this great person? So I'd say it doesn't just start with like, hey, we want to hire a CEO. It starts way before that. Like who's in your network? Who have you been building your network over the years to, have conversations with for this moment when you want to hire someone great? Because recruiters are absolutely important to the process. It's never a smooth process because ideally you've got queued up talent in your network that could be relevant as a CEO or has within their network someone that you can bring in as a CEO. That's probably the best way I'd say to do it, is just like start networking as soon as possible, assuming that you will, if you are the CEO, it's one day you'll be replaced, whether it's at, day one or whether it's at your IPO or whether it's going to be at, 20 years, later, like Sergey Brin. So I think these are all the interesting things to think about for building your network now so that you can prepare to find a good CEO later.
Right. All right, we are almost out of time. And Matt, I'm going to direct this next question to you, and then I'm going to just ask for final thoughts from each of you. Early stage startups have usually a limited amount of capital, have to make a lot of tough decisions. And how do you think about choosing between budget and thoroughness when you're making decisions on things like the IP that you're filing on, the consultants you're bringing on? Manny just answered this to some effect on bringing on the CEO, et cetera. Just is there any advice you can give on budget versus thoroughness?
I know budget's always a constraint, and the answer is like don't skimp on anything, right? Everything's important, but that's not feasible or not reasonable. I think from the VC perspective, one thing companies often make the mistake on is they spend a lot of money in preclinical development and then they skimp on the clinical development, which is really the make or break for any company. like Bruce Booth actually had a bunch on this yesterday on his blog. He's one of the partners at Atlas Venture and blogs a lot on topics related to drug discovery. Um, that companies like outsource to a CRO all of their clinical work. And so like you do all this work preclinically and you take tight control and then you just give somebody else like and the clinical development is like the most important thing, right? Most expensive. It's how you live or die as a company. So, you can read about what he said, but it's like you need to kind of not skimp, especially on clinical development. It's like when things are critical path and your company lives or dies on something, you need to have tons of control. So, an example he gave, which we've seen in our own portfolio, is management teams need to be obsessive about the patients that are enrolled in the trial. Like you can't just leave it up to the CRO to like figure out like, oh yeah, this patient qualified, this patient didn't qualify. You constantly see patients who should not be enrolled in the trial, who did not qualify, being pushed through by the CRO anyways. And so like the management team should be looking at every single patient, the chief medical officer or the CEO, every patient to make sure. Like that's just an example, I'd say, and I know it's for like a later stage kind of effort, right? A clinical stage company, but it's just to give an example of where not to skimp. IP is another place, right? Like you really don't want to skimp on IP. I see a lot of companies skimp on like who they use to keep track of their financials, or use nobody to keep track of their financials as a company. Like it just creates so much mess and so much headache later. So, in the end, you get what you pay for, and it's hard to say, oh, we're going to skimp on this or that. Where companies probably overspend is on preclinical development and wanting to do every single experiment under the sun, that every experiment that gets proposed. And a good CEO knows when to say, like, that's not critical path. We're not doing that experiment. That's a nice to have, not a need to have. So I would say that's like biotech companies often make this mistake because they're often driven by scientists and they want to do all the science experiments. And that doesn't leave enough capital for the other stuff.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much, Matt. Matt and Manny, we have now gone over the time we had allotted. Are there any parting thoughts you would like to provide to our audience members? And I wanted, first of all, note that you guys have been pulling double duty this entire time because you've also been answering questions in the Q&A because we haven't been able to get to all of the questions. So thank you for multitasking and answering some of these questions live, also in writing, not just verbally here. So, but Matt, any parting thoughts you want to impart?
No parting thoughts. Maybe I'll just answer the last question that Manny might be typing up the answer to, which is just, equity percentage, university holding startups. Universities absolutely should get equity. I mean, you're critical to the founding of these companies. But, what can be a deterrent? Like taking 50% equity in the company can be a deterrent. So you got to be thoughtful about it. But universities often deserve to have some equity in these startups, instrumental in founding these things and putting in resources to make them happen. And
Thanks,
thank you
Matt.
for doing what you do.
Yes. And thank you for being our partners. Manny, any parting thoughts from you?
No, just thank you. I know it's just a bizarre and challenging and time of rubbernecking within the university world. And so, when we speak to researchers, they're stressed out and they're trying to figure things out. They're also excited and more entrepreneurial than ever. And so it's a fun time for us. And we're always happy to figure out and brainstorm ways to work and support what you all do. And so just reach out whenever, ask us anything.
Great. Well, thank you to our audience for being here today. Thank you for being so engaged and asking all these terrific questions of Matt and Manny. We're always here to answer your questions about venture capital and university startups. So, and then I, of course, have to really just express my deepest thanks to Matt and Manny for taking their time today to talk with all of us and imparting their wisdom with us. So thank you so much, and everyone enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.